you really want to upset people in America, do anything religious and be funny about it. Because you will always be hurting someone. And they go nuts.
David Steinberg has gone from controversial comedian, the man who got the Smothers Brothers thrown off of CBS in 1968, to a successful director with Seinfeld, Mad About You, and most recently, Curb Your Enthusiasm. Over a career spanning almost 5 decades, he's collaborated with everyone from Groucho Marx to Larry David. We met in his New York apartment.
So, David, you're a Winnipeg boy to begin with. I guess you can't call you a Winnipeg boy anymore. But
No, a Winnipeg old man. Yeah, I'm from Winnipeg. I was born in Saint Boniface, Twin City.
Oh,
yep.
Okay.
Winnipeg.
I didn't realize that the Saint Boniface thing. I didn't know.
Yeah,
it's always
well, Saint Boniface is basically Winnipeg.
Yeah,
it's all one now.
Were you called Duddy when you were a kid?
I was. I'm still called Duddy.
Is that right?
Yeah. My family, my friends, all my Canadian friends, my Winnipeg friends. Whenever I hear someone saying Duddy, I know it's someone from Winnipeg.
So I finished reading your book.
Oh my God!
And
you're the one.
I'm the one.
Yeah.
And available for $16.99 on Amazon.com. By the way.
Really?
Yeah. So and you took a couple of shots at your home city.
Yeah.
And I want to quote them to you
in
case you forgot. You wrote.
Pardon me.
You wrote. Compared to the frigid, barren new land, the old land, this would be Russia, looked like Boca in June. They called the name of this new land Winnipeg, which is Yiddish for something that is only funny in Yiddish. And then a little later on in the book you wrote, nor did the populace perceive God's sense of humor at work in the everyday business of living, like rush hour, menopause, and Winnipeg.
Well, of course, you have to. It was in biblical style.
It was.
Yeah,
yes,
well, that
yes.
isn't the way I talk normally. No, my parents came from Russia, and the Jewish agency I then, transferred you. I guess they arrived in Halifax. I don't even know where they probably.
Yeah.
And they said, where's a city more hellish than where they came from in Russia? St. Boniface, Winnipeg looks
There you
good.
go.
And they sent them in. Well, I'm only talking about the weather.
Yes,
Yeah.
of course.
Americans know nothing about Canada. You know that. It's a xenophobic country. They don't know anything about Canada, they don't know about Mexico. When I tell Americans I'm from Winnipeg, they say, oh, the skiing must be great there. I say, yeah, it's great.
And the name, I guess, for a lot of Americans, too, has a certain exotic ring to it.
Yeah, Winnipeg.
It sounds
right,
just so...
Right.
I finished, not only did I read your book, but I just recently finished reading Paul Schaefer's book, too. Now, here's another nice Jewish boy who flees Thunder Bay.
Yes.
But when he leaves, the visions in his head are of Vegas, which is where his parents took him to when he was a kid, and Miami Beach.
Oh, really? Oh, yes.
This was not the case with you.
No. I went to yeshiva. I went to theological school in Chicago. Growing up in Winnipeg was a great thing. I rarely meet anyone from Winnipeg who was unhappy with their childhood, because there are tons of kids your own age. When I talk about crews in Canada, I'm working with a crew, and there are some people from Winnipeg. There are people who just shot in Winnipeg. I say, well, what do you remember about Winnipeg? He said, the most beautiful women in the world are from Winnipeg. I said, really? I must have missed that. But I say, now that I think about it, yeah.
Huh. So, but you went to a
yeshiva, theological school.
For how long?
I was there for almost 3 years. But remember, I was 15, so I was still coming home for every Jewish holiday, which is almost every 3 weeks.
Yes.
And the summers I would come home. So I was, but basically you're on your own in Chicago, which is pretty daunting.
Yeah.
And I had a roommate who was another Canadian from Edmonton who came up with me, still a friend of mine, Marsh Posto. And it was remarkable to just be in Chicago, where I'd never been before.
Yeah.
And Winnipeg, Minneapolis is where you went to. And in fact, we went to Minneapolis people go to Paris to find out what are they wearing in Minneapolis in those days. That was the big thing in Winnipeg. But I was there, and then I got into the University of Chicago. I went from theological school to Israel on a scholarship for a year. And then when I came back, I got into the University of Chicago, and that was it. I found Second City. And
so I mean, I guess that part of it, though, explains a lot about the bent you took in your material later on.
Yes. Yes.
The religious overtones
Yes,
and the sermons
yeah.
and all of that
Yes, right.
came out of that. Because it always struck me, I thought, well, how does this guy sit around doing Bible studies all the time? How does, because he's drawing on, I mean, his material is accurate.
Yeah.
It may piss people off, but it's accurate,
Yeah, well, when I got to Second City, the thing about Second City in the 60s especially, is you had to have a lot of information. And I was like 22, 23, so you don't have a lot of wisdom, but you do have information, You're learning things for the first time. And then one of the directors said to me, why don't you ever use any of your background, your theological background and all that? And I thought, this is so offensive to me. I'm already an actor and established and a beatnik or a hippie, whatever we were at the time, and he's bringing me back to roots that don't even matter. And one night I just went out and I said, give me any suggestion of an Old Testament personality, and I will improvise a sermon on it. And became an incredible piece of material.
Now, I want to take you back just a little bit before that, because
Sure.
there were a couple of things there that I thought were sort of, seminal in you getting to the point to be able to riff on something that somebody tells you, or the audience, in a certain style.
Yeah.
Seeing Lenny Bruce was a big deal for you.
The biggest deal.
And discovering what improv actually was a big deal for you.
Absolutely, right. Because and all the time I was at theological school, and I went to Israel, and even at the University of Chicago, I sort of was a dropout and not trying to figure out what I could do, but still reading a lot, which, I started reading in Winnipeg because I read comic books. And there were classic comic books that were around at the time, and so someone said, these are actually books that you're reading in short form. I had no idea. And then I read the book. So I've always a reader. So at the University of Chicago, at least I did that. I got a lot of information just because I was into stories. And I had no plan. It wasn't like I was going into show business, but I just needed stories all the time. I needed to read one. I needed to hear them on the radio in Winnipeg, I remember, that started me. And so when we got to Second City, that you have to call on your information, because Second City was breaking through into a new comedy style, which was you play from the top of what you know. You don't play down to the audience. You don't play up to. You play as smart as you could be, without being condescending.
Yes.
But just smart. And so, I got to. I couldn't do anything else except what Second City had to offer. I can't imagine what would have happened to me. I'm not just saying this, Ron. I can't imagine what would have happened to me if I hadn't lucked into Second City.
One of the things that I think, well, in the style that you wrote your book, which is that biblical style from beginning to end, you exaggerate for the purposes of that trope sometimes in the book, and then you have to go to your footnotes to find out what the real story was.
Yes, that was the goal.
So I'm not sure whether this was an exaggeration for the sake of that style or not, but did you really go to about 27 consecutive nights of Second City, wanting to get in?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I didn't do that. I saw Second City at the University of Chicago, and I snuck in to Mandel Hall, and I couldn't get over what it was that I saw. I didn't know they were improvising. I just saw this group of smart, really funny people. Women were gorgeous and interesting and smart. The guys were sharp. I mean, it was astonishing. I said, and I was listening to what they were doing. I said, wait a second, I can do this. I never felt that I could do anything up until that point, except drive my parents crazy by not being able to do anything. And I said, well, there was just a revelation. Now, I didn't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
So I got into theater a little bit, and it even in plays that I did at the University of Chicago, just a couple of them, I always ended up improvising within the plays before I'd even seen Second City. And they let me do that because they said, you're good at this, do it. I didn't even know there was a form that I was doing.
Yeah, interesting. When you, well, I'm going to quote you here from your book again.
Sure.
Because you did come to here in New York. You did a couple of plays. Didn't work out all that well for you.
No, it did not.
No. But you made friends with Sidney Poitier, which has served you to this day.
We're good friends to this day, yeah.
But you talk about going back to Chicago after that, going back to Second City.
Yes.
And you wrote, in all, I spent 6 years at Second City. After my first year, the Chicago Sun-Times reviewer referred to me as Chaplin-esque. As a consequence, for the next 2 years, I didn't get a single laugh, but insisted on having a spotlight on my ass as I waddled towards the wall.
That is the truth.
And while I managed to resist the urge to grow a mustache, I did look into joining the Communist Party. Now, but the shift from what were you before? You were something else before you went Chaplin-esque. Oh no, you were Chaplin-esque first, then you were Groucho-esque, right?
Yeah,
those were the styles that you identify.
Well,
yourself.
Chaplin-esque. I only became Chaplin-esque because this reviewer, Glenn said I was Chaplin-esque. So I said, okay, I'll be Chaplin-esque.
I'll adapt.
You're correct. I thought I'll be vulnerable as could be. But basically, my instinct was more naturally Groucho-esque.
Yes.
And that was fast talking, just out there.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, just as a little aside here, which I thought was interesting in the book, you mentioned that back in '68, the guy who was your agent was David Geffen.
Yes.
Mr. Midas Touch.
Yes.
Except not for you.
No,
he talked you out of The Graduate, is that true?
Well, I just, Graydon Carter's a friend of mine, editor of Vanity Fair, and he had a little gathering, and Geffen was there, and he had read the book, and he said, there's no way that I would have talked you out of The Graduate. I said, I can't believe, you're a billionaire, you've got everything, and this bothers you that...
Well, that's what happened.
That's what happened. Yes. But I said, it had to have been you, because you remember that, he said, and we talked about he was the junior agent to the senior agent.
Right.
That was my agent at the time. And, I got this audition, and he said, where are you going? I said, well, Mike Nichols is doing this play. And he said, this movie. I said, you mean The Graduate? I said, yeah. He said, they're not going to go with a short little Jewish guy. They're going to go with a tall, good-looking guy. Forget about it. Don't even go to that.
But he was kind of right, because they were looking at Redford first for that role, right? Until Hoffman got it. That was always my understanding.
I don't give him that much credit.
Okay, well. Though I did like your description of The Graduate as being the only '60s film that Warren Beatty didn't star in, which I think was probably true.
Right.
All right, so... it's almost, these days, when you think back to the material of yours that seems so controversial, that really steams so many people, it's almost quaint now to think of it.
Yeah,
right?
there's no sort of cultural touchstone for understanding how volatile the time was. And it seems really tame, sometimes lame by comparison. Mm-hmm. But if you really want to upset people in America, do anything religious and be funny about it. Because you will always be hurting someone. And they go nuts.
You made a point in the book, and I thought this was revealing too, about the fact that you remained David Steinberg.
Yes.
That was a big deal.
Very big deal. At that time, there was no David Steinberg out there. All the Jewish comedians had changed their names, and probably if I'd come up when they did, I would have as well. But it just didn't make sense for me, to finally achieve something for yourself and not have Miss McCrum, your English teacher, know that it's you, by changing your name to king or a bishop or some royalty.
As all those guys did.
As all those guys did. But it was always odd. And when I worked in Las Vegas very, very early on in my career, and you saw Steinberg, which is a great name in Vegas because the marquee goes across the whole street. So I worked with Frankie Valli a lot, and you see a little Frankie Valli name as Steinberg. Yeah.
Oh, that's very clever. Actually.
I always thought that people thought that Frankie was working with his accountant because there was no Jewish name out there at all in those days.
Let's talk about the Smothers Brothers, because I think it's interesting. Even in your book, you don't dwell on it too long. But it was you who got them turfed off of CBS.
Yes,
though not without them being willing accomplices.
No. Well, basically, Tommy Smothers was I wouldn't say, they were an incredible comedy team, but Tommy was getting so involved in the counterculture and so upset with what was going on in Vietnam that he loved to push the envelope. So it wasn't just in comedy, but there was no way it was being pushed in comedy. But he would have Joan Baez on when the network didn't want him, Pete Seeger, all these so-called, anti-war socialists. Yeah. And censors determined what went on the air in those days. And he heard me. Alan Bly was a producer of the Smothers Brothers show, and he was a friend of mine from Winnipeg. Mm-hmm. And he had heard about my career had already started. They brought me out to California and said, well, show me what this is. And I did the sermons for Tommy, and he just went nuts. This is great. We've got to put this on television. And I didn't think anything of it. I'd done it at Second City. I recorded an album of the sermons. And once we did it on the air, the next week, Tommy said, I want to show you something. And he opened an office door at CBS, and there were duffel bags, just nothing but duffel bags all over the office. And I said, well, what's that? He said, it's your hate mail. I said, what? Those? And I looked everywhere you went. There was really awful comments. And it was an indication, number one, of how Calvinistic the States is, and where religion was at the time. You couldn't do... First of all, I at the end of the sermon, I said, let's get the Christ back into Christmas and the Chub back into Hanukkah. Well, a Jew saying Christ offended everyone in the South, not knowing that I was in the context of what I was doing.
Yeah.
And then CBS said to Tommy, okay, we've done the sermon. They were very sort of respectful. We don't want to defang Steinberg. He's great. Have him back on, but no more sermons. And
to which Tommy said,
I did a character, one of my first, it was a character called Honk that eventually became my psychiatrist character. The audience really liked it, and Tommy said, why don't we do another sermon? So I said, okay. And I literally did it the way I did at Second City. I took a suggestion from the audience, and they gave me, the suggestion was Jonah. And I did the sermon of Jonah, and basically I was playing a Reformed rabbi, sort of pompous guy at the time. And then at one point in Jonah I say, and at this point I say, Jonah is swallowed by a whale. And here the New Testament scholars and the Old Testament scholars differ. The New Testament scholars say that Jonah could not have been swallowed by a whale because whales have tiny gullets and cannot swallow whole prophets. They literally grabbed the Jews by the Old Testament. And when I said
that's all it took.
That was this gesture. They cut out this gesture for the taping that never got on the air. And then when we got to court, they played it. When the Smothers Brothers were suing them, and they asked me. They said, "What were you referring to? You were saying Old Testament." I said, "I was hoping people would think testicles," and of course they all laughed, including the guy who was asking me these questions. And Smothers Brothers won $1 million back from CBS.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about Johnny Carson. In
Sure.
the book, you talk about first getting asked on. And again, for the purposes of the biblical style that you write in, you talk about being bumped for 40 nights, I think, before you got on. But you did get bumped a lot, though.
I got bumped for 4 nights.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
Yeah. Every night they announce you. I've never been on a big national television show. I was on The Tonight Show before the Smothers Brothers show. And every night you're not going on. So, it was...
Your mother said something to you about this, did she?
Yeah, my mother says, honey, maybe they're just going to say your name. And maybe you're not... I had lied about so many things as a teenager that there was no reason for her to believe ever that I was going on. The fact that my name was up there, she thought, well, that's as much as this kid could have accomplished.
You wrote in the book, I thought this was great, that when you finally got on Johnny's, not only on the show, but on the couch, that Irving, who you identify as your agent at the time, you write, thus did David know that he would not any longer have to be considered Winnipeg's answer to Wayne and Schuster. Great news, Boychuk, said Irving. I can get you a 6-episode guest arc on Chico and the Man.
Yes, well, Irving was my agent. It was Irving Arthur. He didn't get me on Chico and the Man, but I'll tell you what did happen. That wasn't in the book. So it was the third night that I was announced on the show. And Tony Bennett was the only guest. And then I was going to come on. And Carson did a long, his character, and Flabby, and all these characters went into the audience, and it was an hour and a half at that time. And then it's almost been 40 minutes of show before he even brings Tony Bennett out. Then he brings Tony Bennett out. And Tony Bennett, who's an amazing singer, is not exactly a raconteur, big talking guy.
If you've seen the interview that he did with Elvis Costello, you'd know that for a fact.
Yeah, I didn't see that. Painful, yeah.
Painful.
This night, it's golden nuggets coming out of his mouth. He's telling stories. He's articulate. He's building sandcastles in the air. It's amazing. He's going for 3 segments, and he hasn't even done a song yet. And I'm waiting, and there's 30 minutes left in the Tonight Show for me to get on. So Irving Arthur, my agent, is there. He said, don't worry, you're going to get on. And Tony Bennett does another 15-minute segment. There's only 15 minutes left. I have 10 minutes of material I'm supposed to do. And Irving said, look, I'm going to go talk to Rudy, who was the producer. He went to talk to Rudy Tejas, and he said, you've got to put Steinberg on. You don't realize what you're doing. He's a star from Second City, and this is a comer. You can't treat him this way. And I hear him, and I'm so impressed. He's carrying on. I could hear him hollering at the producer at the commercial break. And then he comes back and said, well, what's going to happen? He said, you're going on tomorrow night. You're not going on tonight, but come on, let's go. We put on our coats, and we're walking out. And faint in the background, I heard Tony Bennett sing, and now I'd like to sing I Left My Heart in San Francisco. And Irving said, wait a sec, I love this song. we stood there and listened to the guy who just stabbed me in the heart sing this, to me, not a great song.
You did something like 130 guest shots on Carson, right? Plus hosting on a number of occasions.
Yeah, not counting hosting. Quite a few.
Yeah. Tell me about that experience, just from your own personal standpoint. Was it nerve-wracking for you, or did it become second nature after all? I guess you must have gotten used to it.
You know, I got used to it once I sat down with Carson. And, you know, when you're hosting The Tonight Show, or guest hosting, and you're a comedian, all you're thinking about is the monologue. That's all that really matters, is what is that monologue and how is it going to go over. So you have that nervousness for that. But I never went on The Tonight Show without being nervous before I went on. Because the reason I had this sort of longevity on The Tonight Show, at least in the early years, is all the comedians in the 60s, they had sort of come from the Catskills, where they worked on material for years that were amazing material, but they only did that material over and over again. And so I had a background in improvisation, so I could talk about anything and improvise with Carson, as could Woody Allen, Joan Rivers, a lot of us. And so that was one of the reasons that I had this sort of longevity. But I never walked on without being nervous, because I knew that if I didn't improvise, I just went to what I had in mind to do, it would never be as exciting with Carson, because he could always tell the difference.
Yeah.
And because he never knew what, I just gave him subjects. When you host the show, you have a list of questions that the guest is going to talk about. No one goes on the show without being coordinated, it's called. So once I had hosted the show, I realized I'm concentrating on the questions. I can't hear the guest that much. So when I guested, I said to Johnny, I'm just asking you about the Lakers or dating. That's all he had to ask me. And he could come in whenever he wanted, and whatever I'd thought about the week before, the day before in this area that I never tried out loud before, he would always come in with a better line. He would top me anywhere that we were connected in a way that most of the guests aren't, because they're not really improvising.
Yeah.
So I just lucked into that.
The other thing, too, that I just found absolutely amazing about the circumstance that you ended up being in as a very young man, actually, was being able to have lunch every Tuesday with Groucho Marx, who you brilliantly in the book, by the way, refer to as Charlie Sheen without the restraining order, which I think was a great description, and Jack Benny and George Burns.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about how that came about and what that was like.
Well, there was a producer named Arthur Whitelaw who wanted to do a Gypsy had become a very successful play, and they said, well, you know, the Marx Brothers story is a little bit like that. Groucho was getting very popular. I'd already had him on a television show, that my first show of my own, which was called Music Scene, right after the Smothers Brothers, and he co-hosted one week with me, and I was hired to write the story of, it was called Minnie's Boys. It actually went to Broadway with not my draft but another draft. But in that year, for 6 months of it at the very least, every Tuesday at Hillcrest, which is a country club, every Tuesday he would have lunch with George Burns, Jack Benny, Irving Fine, and himself. And I would sit there with these three guys, and I was 27, 28. I was always aware that this was I remember this for the rest of my life, every single one of these lunches. And I did.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
Did you feel at all, I know you write about this in the book a little bit, and in fact, it's interesting, because this passage in the book is the one that is the least in the biblical style, almost as if you can't stop yourself from describing it the way it actually was.
Yeah.
And I get the sense from the way you write about it that that you had a certain trepidation about opening. You would laugh at things.
Yes.
But talk about the whole laughing, not laughing phenomenon, which really intrigued me.
Well, everything that George Burns said, Jack Benny laughed at, and Benny was not he was not sort of an aggressive comic type. Burns would just I wouldn't say dirty or whatever the term was. There was nothing out of limits for Burns, and he would talk about women they had known together, critics that they all hated, the same critic in Philadelphia who'd panned them.
50 years earlier.
50 years, right. So Burns said he gave Fink's Mules a better review than he gave me and Gracie. But Benny laughed at everything George said, and Groucho was sort of laid back, but he would have a line that would be a zinger every once in a while. And it just... Unbelievable.
In our last couple of minutes, I want to ask you about Joey Gallo. I have to ask you about Joey
Okay,
Gallo.
yes.
You were Joey Gallo, Crazy Joe Gallo's best man.
Yes.
Now, my sense from what you write about, the way you write about it in the book, as opposed to the way other people have depicted it over the years, is that you were sort of taken in as a kind of reluctant pet, almost.
I was. Yeah, Joey said to me when he got out of prison, I met him through Jerry Orbach.
Yeah.
And Jerry Orbach and his then wife Marta, they were championing him because they said he was, rehabilitated and all that. And it wasn't just me. I'd go to their house and Doc Simon would be there, and Peter Stone, the playwright, and Buddy Greco. I mean, everyone was sort of around him, and he was a really sort of smart character. But he told me, he said, in Attica, you were everyone's favorite comedian.
There you go. Yeah, that's the Siskel and Ebert of recommendations.
Exactly. I live for that, Joey. But I knew him no better than anybody else. But I was always very irreverent with him. Everyone's a little sort of tiptoeing around him and all that. He didn't need any of that.
Because they're all afraid of being killed.
Well,
weren't you?
Yes. I mean, we never hugged each other. In those days, the sort of hugging came later when men started hugging each other. But I went to the Copacabana the night that he was killed, and I sat with my ex-wife in one end of the room, and Jerry and Marta were on the other side of the Copa, and Rickles was performing. And then afterwards, Jerry and Marta, they were always championing him, said, it's Joey's birthday, and you've got to come out with him, David. You never go out afterwards. And I never went out because it was Joey. I don't go out afterwards. Anyway, you're a comedian. You're out all the time. I want to go home. So I said, no, I'm not going out after the show. But Joey was standing there. I said, Joey, forgive me. I know it's your birthday, but I'm not going out. And he gave me an embrace, and I felt the gun. First time I've ever,
Yes.
and I didn't say anything.
Or are you just happy to see me?
Right,
Yeah.
of course. I didn't say anything to him. But I just was determined not to go. And they really did a full court press on going with him. Yeah. That was the night.
That was the night.
He went to Umberto's. I stopped Marta and Jerry from going. And if I would have been there, that would have been the end of my career. That would be all that people knew me for.
When did you find out that he'd been shot? The next morning?
Newspapers the next morning. There was no television all night. Anything. I went and got the newspaper. I was in shock.
I bet.
Yeah. But it's a footnote that most people never pick up on my career that is really quite remarkable.
It is. Well, it sort of reminds me of Mort Saul saying when he was flying with Jack Kennedy in a plane and they hit turbulence. And Kennedy came back and said, if we all die, it'll say President dies in air crash yes. along with reporters. And,
yes.
and that'd be it for you.
Absolutely true.
All right, we got about a minute left here, and, okay. and there's a whole other part. I mean, this is just your career up to that point, but you've been involved in television in some major series
yep.
now for the last couple of decades,
yep.
and you're still doing it with
yep.
no. My sense is that you're not stopping at all. Will you ever?
No, I have no reason to. I did some shows in Canada. I'll continue with those. Curb Your Enthusiasm. We're writing it right now. We're on show number 4.
This will be season 8.
When does this show air?
Next summer.
Next time. Oh, it's good because no one knows that we're coming back yet.
Oh,
yeah, right. Yeah, we're on.
Well, then my friends are very happy. Right
yeah,
okay.
we're on show number 4, and
Excellent.
I'll be directing that again. And I just can't imagine what I'd do if I wasn't doing all this stuff.
Yeah. Well, it was good of you to do this. I appreciate you taking the time. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure.
Okay. All right.